Hey everyone, thanks for joining us and welcome to this Practical Farmers of Iowa Farminar. I am Steve Carlson and I work with PFI as a beginning farmer and program associate. And tonight we have Matteson and Rose Schick in the house, who came over to the PFI office from Nevada, Iowa, where they co-own and operate Lee's Greens. And we've asked them to talk tonight about getting started in greenhouse production, so they'll discuss their business, how they got started, some learning experiences they've had, and they'll go into their greenhouse crops, what markets they utilize, and really whatever else you'd like to ask about. But first we're going to talk a little about PFI and our Farminar series. We hold these every Tuesday night during the fall and winter months at 7 p.m. Central Time. After tonight, there are about 5 more this fall season. And if you're interested in this topic, you might also be interested in a couple of these other topics. For instance, next week is cover crops for vegetable production. And then on December 15th, that topic will be record keeping for fruit and vegetable production. We've got full descriptions and speaker information on the Farminar page that you used to get here. And we've also got a winter series that will run coming up in mid-January into March. So plenty more topics to come this winter if you don't see something that really piques your interest there. And if you're not familiar, Practical Farmers of Iowa is celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, having started back in 1985. PFI is a nonprofit organization made up of farmers and friends of farmers. And our farmers come from farms of all sizes and enterprises and from across the state and beyond. Our mission at PFI is strengthening farms and communities through farmer-led investigation and information sharing. We use farmer-led investigation and information sharing to help farmers practice an agriculture that benefits both the land and the people. Our values at PFI: welcoming everyone, creativity, collaboration, and community, viable farms now and for future generations, and stewardship and ecology. So if you're not already a PFI member, you should join us. Your membership supports our organization and gives you access to our awesome network of members. You'll also get our newsletter, discounts to our events, you'll get opportunities to participate in our research projects, and all of our programming. Our members definitely help guide our programming, which includes this Farminar and other Farminar topics and just about everything else that we do. So you can find more information about PFI and membership on our website. Of course, don't forget to check out our event calendar for both PFI and non-PFI events, and there's a whole load of stuff coming up pretty soon. This is the time of year that many people in agriculture find themselves with a little bit of extra time, except maybe for Lee and Rose, who are growing in their greenhouses year-round. But a lot of you have time to brush up on business and production skills, so check that event calendar up for a bunch of really cool stuff coming up, which includes our annual conference. And the annual conference is going to be on January 22nd and 23rd in Ames, Iowa. And the theme this year is celebrating 30 years of farmers teaching farmers, and it's going to be an awesome weekend as always. This year, actually, we have John Kemp, who will deliver a keynote address on common characteristics of successful farmers, and that should be pretty interesting. He is a farmer and the founder of Advancing Eco-Agriculture. And this cool fact about John speaking for us, actually, John Kemp was asked to speak for the United Nations on the same weekend as our conference, but he chose PFI over the UN, which is pretty sweet. So you can get all the details about our conference on the website. A lot of really cool stuff. Check that out. And before we get started, please remember, like I said, it looks like you all know what you're doing. Enter your location in the chat box because we like to collect that for grant reporting. And if you want to help guide the topics for next season's Farminars, then yeah, give us your email address and we can stay in touch. If you have questions for our presenters tonight, then please enter them into that same chat box, and Lee and Rose may address them as they come, or we're going to reserve plenty of time at the end, and we can go over those at the end of their presentation. And as always, this is being recorded, and we will have this in our Farminar archives within a couple of days. So if you miss one of the future Farminars, you can always check that archive, and it's going to be in there. So thanks everybody for joining us, and now I'm going to switch the presentations here and let Lee and Rose take it away.
Good evening, this is Lee Matteson.
And I am Rose. We are Lee's Greens out of Nevada, Iowa.
So I grew up on a small farm in southeast Iowa, and I went to Iowa State and graduated with a BS in horticulture. And then after graduating, I worked at Olive Garden and Greenhouse for 7 years as the head grower, where we grew a lot of transplants, flowers. And after that, I decided that I wanted to do something a little different. So I switched gears and I got a farm manager position at Berry Patch Farm, where I was in charge of growing around 50 acres of fruits and some vegetables, as well as doing some greenhouse work with fruits and vegetables inside the greenhouse.
And I grew up in northeast Iowa on a dairy farm. I then went to Ellsworth Community College and transferred into ISU into the horticulture program. I got my BS there. And I then went and got my master's degree in horticulture and specialized in genetics. Traveled a lot around the country working at various greenhouses and landscaping jobs, and came back to the Midwest and worked at ISU in plant genetics, and got a little tired of working in a lab with no windows, wanted to get back out in the dirt. And so then I got a job at Berry Patch Farm, where that is where I met Lee, and that's how we got started trying to start this business.
So I'm going to just start out kind of how we got started, and I'll go into a little more detail as we get along in the presentation. We're also trying to help beginning farmers and let them know how they can get started in a business similar to what we're doing, and maybe help them avoid some of the pitfalls that we ended up encountering. So some of my background experience that I had talked a little bit about was greenhouse flower production, bedding plants, transplants. We've done a lot of fruits and vegetable production indoors and outdoors. I've always had to kind of be in a managerial position where I've always worked with a lot of other people, making sure they did their tasks that were required. We've always had to work with a lot of coworkers. And then Rose has a little other experience.
Yeah, most of my greenhouse experience at ISU was doing research on field crops, but also very much specific to how to set up rotations and continual product. So that was helpful later on when we started this business.
So when we met at the Berry Patch Farm, we eventually decided we wanted to go out on our own and kind of start our own business. And so the idea that we wanted to do was we both wanted to manage our own successful business. Some of the other things we looked at is the main crops that we were really interested in are fruits and vegetables. We also wanted to look at production practices, particularly interested in using greenhouses along with growing stuff outside as well. And then of course, always we both wanted to make enough income for 2 individuals. And then at the very end of the day, we want to enjoy what we're doing. So the planning part is we needed to find some land and acquire it. And the next step would be finding funding. After that, we want to look at greenhouse structures, which ones we prefer, which ones we thought we would try and changed our mind, decided not to use. And then we also wanted to pick out what specific crops we wanted to grow inside and outside. We also, want to look at your potential markets that you want to sell to. This is very key. There's no sense in growing a whole crop of something and then nobody wants to buy it. So make sure you find your market outlets before you even grow the crop. We'll look at buildings, plants, and utility layouts. And then finally, soil preparation before you even do any planting. So in the execution for the land, at the time when I was looking, there wasn't a lot of land available for sale. And so I happened to find a 3-acre lot that was residential / ag zoned, and it was located between Nevada and Colo. And I just so happened to live in Colo, and Rose lives in Nevada, so it was perfectly right in the middle. Granted, it's only 3 acres, but it's amazing how much that you can grow in just a little 3-acre lot. And to acquire this land, I actually got a family that was able to help me purchase the land. When we first started, we looked at funding options, and it seems like everyone you talk to, oh, you're a beginning farmer, you should have no problem finding funding sources. The problem we ran into is when we started the business, it just happened to be during the year when the federal government was shutting down, and a lot of the governmental programs had no idea where they were going to get funding, how much they were going to get, and so we weren't able to use hardly any of the USDA funding just because of the time factor. We were looking at 6 months to a year before we'd be able to even get on the list or get funding. So we went a couple different routes. We did use the NRCS. We were actually able to get funding for a high tunnel greenhouse, and that really helped us kind of get us on our feet and get started. We also used personal loans from ourselves, and then also another bank that we got an interest loan from. And the key to this is find your funding well in advance. Like I said, we wanted to start the business. We were trying to get up and going in the fall, and all of a sudden the government was shut down, so that ruled out a lot of different funding options, and we were able to have to just go with ourselves.
And I just want to make a comment about the SBA, because that's advertised a lot that it's very easy to go in there and get a loan for a small business. And unfortunately, I found that not to be the case. The bank that I went into and did all the paperwork for, in the end, told me that unless you are an already established business with some, I think, 3 to 5 years of, books or unless you were starting a franchise, that was the only way they were going to give us a loan. So if you have no background, as in books of any sort, or have your business already started for a number of years, we did not find the SBA to be a funding source for us.
So then in the structures, we first decided that we wanted to save as much land as possible, and we were going to go with gutter connects. And when we started looking at our crops and what we were going to grow in there, a lot of what we grow is salad greens in the wintertime, so we don't heat the greenhouses very much. And when I worked at Hollubs, they have a lot of gutter connect greenhouses, and in the wintertime we have a lot of snow, and I would notice a lot of buildup in the gutters, and eventually one year we actually had a collapse. So that's why we decided not to go with gutter connects and just go with single style hoop houses. We do have a question about the student loans, if either of us had student loans. I did at the time, but they weren't a lot, and I was able to get them paid off really before we started the business.
And I already had my student loans paid off several years ago, so I did not need that.
And I have wanted to start my own business for a long time, and I decided it was best just to wait, get some experience at other places, kind of make your mistakes at growing stuff there instead of going out on your own and make all the mistakes yourself. And so that's why I decided to wait before I started my own business. Our main structures that we grow in, we have two 30 by 96 greenhouses, and they are double poly greenhouses with air pumped in between the layers. Then we have two 34 by 96 greenhouses, and this is by far the largest greenhouse that I would ever want to put on, just because it's so hard to get the big sheets of poly up and over them. It was definitely a challenge. And then we also built a 30 by 45 pole building, and this is our main pack shed, our warehouse, storage. We also have a germination chamber in this room, office, and so I'll talk a little more about that, about the germination room later. And then this year we just put up the house that I really like and prefer, and that's a 30 by 72 polycarbonate greenhouse. So polycarbonate is a rigid structure greenhouse that's used for the roof and the sides. I did have a question about the greenhouses being heated in the wintertime, and we do heat them, and it's usually just 35, 40 degrees at night because we're growing salad greens all winter, and that's kind of not the optimum, but the lower range of the temperature, so you don't really need anything warmer than that.
And we are using propane heat for our greenhouses.
So we started building our structures in June, July, August. We wanted to have them all up and going by the end of August, because that was our main plant date. Was we wanted to have started sowing stuff in August, that way we would have it ready to sell in about 6 weeks after sowing. So these are three of the houses here, and they're just a Gothic style hoop house. And this is what they looked about like a week ago. They're all double poly, 2 fans in each end to pull air through. I didn't do any roll-up sides because at the time we're kind of out in an exposed area and wind can be a concern. And so when you're looking at your site selection and what houses to put up, keep in mind where you're at and the winds and what kind of winters you do have.
Neither Lee or I live at this site, and so if you suddenly have a wind come up, or we're not like right there on that site to close stuff down, and so we were more concerned that everything stayed safe and not blew away, so we went with that.
And with the roll-up side greenhouses, you almost need to be right there. If a big gust comes up, you need to get them closed up, otherwise have them automated. And since we're just beginning limited funds, automation just wasn't there for us. This is our 30 by 45 pole building. We did have a crew come in and put it in, but we did all the inside building area, the individual rooms, germination room. And then this is our final house, the polycarbonate house. It's all polycarbonate except for the north side we put tin on. Since the sun is always coming in from the south, the tin on the north side, we'll put insulation in there, and that'll just help to keep it warmer in the wintertime. And so all these houses are facing east-west orientation. So the crops that we were really interested in doing, that we wanted for sure, are high-value crops. And of course, those are fruits and vegetables. So in the fruits, when we first got going in the spring, our first spring, we started strawberries. And then we got some red and black raspberries planted, along with 1 row of blackberries. And then since most of your fruits are kind of perennial crops, they take 1 to 2 or 3 years to get going before you start getting a lot of harvest off them. We decided we also needed to do vegetables to kind of supplement our income. So we did tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, beans, corn, sweet potatoes, and salad greens. The other key that we wanted to emphasize is what seasons we were going to produce them in. So we do early raspberries, tomatoes, zucchinis, squash, cucumbers, peppers, and eggplants. And we also do some mints and herbs in the greenhouses. So we're able to get stuff going early, get early season prices before anything else comes on outside. And then we also do late season. So we do the peppers, beans, eggplant, tomatoes, and raspberries as well. So after everybody's had a frost and you've lost your outside production, we are still carrying stuff into, just like a week ago, we tore out green beans. And then kind of our key thing that we really wanted to focus on was kind of all winter production. So this is where we're growing our cool crops, our lettuce, spinach, kale, arugula, Swiss chard, radishes, turnips. And we do microgreens, some in the greenhouse and some in our germination room. So we do a lot of our main marketing. Some of it's to farmers markets, and this is our stand at Main Street in Ames. This is a lot of the produce that you'll see at our stands. Squashes, radishes, turnips. We do a lot of jams and jellies since we grow a lot of our own fruit. We also do transplants. You see rhubarb there and some herbs.
We're very popular at the farmers market because we can offer produce that is earlier than everybody else and then later than most other places also. So the farmers market managers like to see us there, being able to offer something that the other producers don't have yet. So it's worked out good.
So we'll have tomatoes usually around the 1st of June, and we actually carried tomatoes late into the season. So at the last farmer's market, I think at the end of October, we still had some tomatoes on our table. These are some of our microgreens that we grow in the germination room. On the left are pea shoots, and on the right are red radish shoots. And we actually cut these about this size right now, and we deliver them to restaurants to put them on top of certain dishes or as a garnish. And they are very flavorful. The peas, they taste just exactly like peas. Radishes, just a kind of a mild radish flavor. And then kind of our key things that we were really focused on were berries. And this year was our first harvest of strawberries, red raspberries, black raspberries, and blackberries. And these are just some of the pictures of our black raspberries on the left and our red raspberries on the right.
We're pretty excited about next year for a lot of our berries because they'll get up a little higher as they get a more mature plant. So right now you're picking down at your knees, and we're be a little bit easier on us next year when they're up a little higher. Here's just another example of some produce we bring to the farmers market. A lot of our salad greens, again, we're able to have right away the first week of May, and sometimes, we get to beat out a lot of other farmers by having our greenhouses still have salad greens that early.
We are not organic. We decided not to because in the greenhouses, we have to get fertilizer in there when we need it. We do, however, only use organic certified chemicals in the greenhouses. Our main pest that we have to worry about is aphids. So that's why we're not organic, just because of the fertilizer that we have to inject into the fertilizer lines. So like I said, you want to make sure you find out your markets before you even start a business. So when we first started, I already had connections at a lot of restaurants in Ames. And when we first got going, we decided we needed to increase those. And so we went to Des Moines and we started knocking on doors. And we picked up several different restaurants in Des Moines as well as in Ames. So we probably do about 15 to 20 different restaurants in Ames and Des Moines total, on and off throughout the whole year. We're a part of a couple different CSAs that we sell produce. And then we're part of the Iowa Food Co-op down in Des Moines, and you'll see our produce on there as well, year-round. We do 3 farmers markets. We do the Main Street Farmers Market in Ames on Saturday mornings. We usually do Colo Farmers Markets on Thursdays and Roland's Farmers Market on Thursdays. We would like to pick up a little bigger market on Thursdays just because of the smaller markets. You just don't sell a lot of berries and other produce. And when you're harvesting strawberries, for an example, in the spring, we'll go out there and pick 200 to 300 quarts every other day, and the produce doesn't wait for you to find a person to sell it to. So you got to constantly have a market, every 3 days throughout the week to be able to get rid of everything.
It's kind of the downside of berries is they pretty much need picking every other day, and you've got to sell it again within probably 2 days, have that sold. So, if you don't have a big enough market, you got to come up with some place to sell them. So we would like a bigger market, either Wednesday or Thursdays that we could sell to. We're also considering next year doing the occasional Des Moines farmers market if we have to. We're not too thrilled about going down to Des Moines farmers market, but we'll have to see.
We had a question about, do we hire help? Right now, we've just had a couple local high schooler students come out and help us part-time when we needed a little help picking strawberries and weeding. Other than that, for a couple weeks out of the year, Rose and I do everything ourselves. My wife and kids come out and help a little bit, and her husband comes out and helps. And so that's all the help that we have. We do all the harvesting, the delivering, the book work. The reason why we do that is it keeps your costs down. When you're beginning and starting out on your own, you just don't have the money to hire a lot of help or other people to do the books. So it's something that you have to take it upon yourself to do.
Yeah, I would say probably 95% is done by the two of us. And it's something you need to consider if you're going to be starting in this. If you can be away from your family a lot, it takes a lot of hours, especially during the summer, during berry time. You're gone a lot. So.
Some of the other markets that we sell to is PFI. They've ordered our fruit and our salad greens at their winter meetings, And then we've also had other organizations approach us and ask for, similar things, salads for their special events or meetings that they're having. And then also local friends and family in our community. We send out a weekly text message, and people just order and we drop it off, as they want it. So the overall layout and soil preparation was very important to us. Since we were only dealing with 3 acres of land, we had to put the greenhouses located in certain areas so that way we didn't waste a lot of land. And you also have to worry about sun blockage. If one house is too close to the next in the middle of the winter, the sun gets so low that you can actually shade the next house right next to it. So we had to make sure we placed them just far enough apart, but not too far to waste a lot of space. And then the outside crops, we wanted to make sure we maximize land usage as well. So I've got some pictures and you'll see where we even planted between the greenhouses. And we even spaced stuff as close as together, just enough room to get our equipment down to help us with weeding, harvesting, mowing. And then last but not least is soil testing. Make sure you test your soil before you even plant your crops to make sure that you can correct any fertilizer deficiencies or pH before you plant. It's very important. It's a lot harder to correct it before than after your crop is already planted and you're going out there trying to side dress something on. So our only equipment that we mainly have is a small Kubota tractor, and then we bought the implements that attach to it, like the mower, tiller, and cultivator. Otherwise, pretty much all of the work is done by hand. On the greenhouse spacing, we actually went with 15 foot between the greenhouses, and that seemed to work out pretty well. So here's a picture where we planted vegetables down between the greenhouses. So this is in the summertime, and we pull shade cloths on all the greenhouses just because it gets too hot in there. You'll actually lose a lot of blooms on your tomato plants if it gets above a certain temperature. And then between this house on the left, we actually put potted plants of blackberries. These are primocane fruiting blackberries. So our goal was to put these in pots, get them going in the greenhouse early, move them outside, and we trellised them up and produce an early crop on them outside. For some reason, it just didn't work that well. They didn't produce as much as we thought they would. They just grew a lot of foliage.
They put on a lot of growth and got very hard to manage. They weighed so much they just wanted to fall over. The pot wasn't heavy enough to keep them upright.
Then the picture on the right are actually cherry bushes, and so these will only get 6 foot tall, and they'll have tart cherries on them. So this is a perennial crop, and I picked one that won't get very tall because, again, I don't want a 10-foot tall tree between my greenhouses and then shade it in the winter time. So that's why I went with something short. So this is our germination room. It's a 10 by 12 room that we built inside of our pole building. And on the walls, it's like 10-inch insulation styrofoam, and even on the ceiling. And then each shelf has its own light. We grow all of our own transplants in our germination room, mainly because of past experiences. One year we decided to try some grafted tomato plants, and they came in February because that is when we need to transplant them into the greenhouse to get June tomatoes. And when they arrived in the box, they were all frozen. And in February, you just can't run down to Walmart or Lowe's and get another flat of tomatoes. And so we decided that to make sure that we we get the crops in when we need to, and we get the production we need. We just grow our own.
Because we time everything we plant to, save space in our germination room, and there is only so much space in there. It really threw off our whole planting schedule because we were expecting these plants, at a certain time and to be able to go into the greenhouses at a certain time. And after that, we'll just rely on ourselves and not have grafted ones. So a lesson learned.
I had a question about the germ room heated. We're lucky here we don't have to heat it because the lights give off so much heat. We actually have to open the door to the germination room and let the excess heat the rest of the building. Otherwise, if we kept it shut, it would get up easily in the 90s. As it is with the door open, it usually stays 70, 75 degrees. We also start a lot of our herbs. So Rose is pointing at some sweet basil there. And you can see tomato transplants up on the top shelf. You can see down on the floor there is a dehumidifier. Since this is a small room with lots of heat, and of course you have to water the plants, you're going to have a lot of moisture. So we learned right away that we had to have a dehumidifier in there to be able to keep the humidity levels around 55–60%. Otherwise, you just have a lot of diseases breaking out. And we do use fluorescent lights. So outside, we go into our strawberry crop. As you can see, the brown strips in between there, that's where we've mowed off for the aisles. When we first planted, we looked at our tractor tire spacing, and we planted them too close. So this spring, when we picked them, it was a solid mat of berries. And we decided that just was not going to work. And so we mowed off every other row. And as you can see, it looks a lot nicer. And this next spring, we'll actually have an aisle to go down and kneel in.
It was probably taking 2 to 3 times as long to pick the strawberries because it was just one big solid mat. And so we realized even though we had to kill off a lot of plants, it was worth it in the end. It's going to make us be able to pick a lot easier next year. So
this is our black raspberry trellising and blackberry. So we trellis them up about 6 to 6.5 foot tall, and we keep pruning them as we go so that way they kind of flush out. And this is my by far the favorite crop. And this year, each one of these rows is 200 foot long, and we would produce about 50 half pints. And with this year's new growth, I'm estimating next year's at being about 3 to 4 times that. And that's what we'd really like to see.
And again, we make these aisles just big enough to get the tractor down with the mower, again, to save space and get as much production we can off of our 3 acres.
So somebody had asked when was the picture taken in the germ room. You can see Rose, I think, was in her hat, stocking cap there and heavy coat. So it was in the middle of the winter time. We also have 2 big swimming pools, one on each side of the building, and we collect rainwater so that we can irrigate some of our crops outside during a drought year. This last 2 years, our first year we only had to irrigate once, and then this past year we didn't have to irrigate at all because we've had a lot of rain this year. We also use rye as a cover crop over the winter, and then we till it down in the spring. Our main greenhouse production cycle, if you're interested in kind of starting your own little greenhouse, and this is for heated greenhouses. There's a lot of other different terms like a cold frame or a high tunnel, and a lot of those will just have one layer of poly and they won't be heated. And so in those instances, you're just extending the season a little bit in the fall and you're making it a little earlier in the spring, but you're not able to go all winter long because of course you will eventually get cold periods that will frost your plants inside. Where we use heated greenhouses and we never let them get below, say, 40 degrees. So in mid-August is when we first plant our first greens, and we usually always have problems with spinach because the soil temperature gets too high. So once the soil temperature gets above, I think 70, 75 degrees, it's really hard to germinate spinach. So then usually you have to wait a couple weeks.
We had a lot of difficulty this year because it's been such a warm fall this year, where of course other years we haven't had a problem. So every fall or late summer is going to be different depending on what the weather is doing.
So then we grow these greens all winter long till the end of May. And then in about mid-February, we transplant our tomatoes. And so those transplants will be about 6 weeks old, and we'll have sown them and grown them in our germination room up until that point to save on heating costs. And then we move these tomatoes out into the greenhouse at that time. And then once we get closer to March, we start transplanting zucchinis, summer squash, and cucumbers into these beds as well. And then in May, we also transplant peppers and eggplant. As you can see, those crops that we go to later and later are warmer and warmer weather crops, so that way we don't have to heat quite as much. And then we've tried raspberries all different times throughout the year. We've had them in the spring, we've had them late in the fall, the winter, and we've even grown them late into the winter. So in every greenhouse, we have raised beds. Most of them have 5 to 6 raised beds that are about 3 foot wide. Again, in the greenhouse, we've tried to maximize our space, so you'll see the aisles are very narrow, just enough to be able to walk down through with a tub to be able to cut greens. So all of our salad greens, we direct sow right into the beds, and we usually put 5 rows to a bed. And then we lay out drip irrigation just to help conserve on water. And in the wintertime, you don't want to be overhead irrigating, otherwise you're going to have a lot of moisture on the plants. That's just going to cause a lot of more molds.
This bed here is actually covered with plastic, and another issue you have with greenhouses is they actually rain down a lot of drips in very cold water from condensation that collects on the interior of your plastic. So we actually have to protect our seedlings in the beds from getting dripped on, or it actually washes them out or kills them from being constantly wet all the time. So it's something I never knew about before we started this business, that it actually, because we keep the temperature so low inside of our greenhouses, that it actually causes other problems. So something else you have to deal with in the winter time inside the greenhouse.
There's always challenges. Somebody asked about weeding. When we first started, we had a huge flush of weeds, and we spent hours just hand weeding. But once you get past the first year or so, the weeding is very minimal because you're not disturbing that soil a whole lot. And since they're in the greenhouses, they're protected a lot from new seeds being blown in. So like right now, we don't really have a lot of weeds to have to contend with. So this is what a house looks like at about 6 weeks after sowing. We're cutting spinach right now. So the way we harvest is we use scissors. We just go right down the row, pull them up, bunch them, chop them right off, throw them in the tub, and then we take the tub into our pack shed where we pack them to however many pounds people want, a restaurant wants. You can see behind us is red kale, and then further is our lettuce mix. And so everything is cut by hand. We have tried a little Johnny's harvester with the drill operating run. We have found that it doesn't work very well just because we're looking at a high value crop here, so it's got to look nice. And once we use the drill, it chops it up more, it leaves a lot in the bed, and so we cut it by hand just because it makes a nice clean smooth surface after we've cut it. Everything's cleaned up and it's not all shredded up and messed up.
We would like to find a cutter that would work better, but so far for our small of a scale, we just have not found one yet, and so we still are cutting by hand with the scissors.
So for how many cuttings we get off of each crop, lettuce we usually look at 3 to 4 cuttings during the winter time. So it takes 6 weeks to get up to the first cut, and then it's usually 4 to 5 week grow back between cuts. After about the 3rd to 4th cut, it starts getting pretty bitter, so we rip it out and replant. Red kale, green kale, you can usually cut almost all winter long. And then spinach, we started cutting about 1st of September, and we didn't quit cutting last year until about April. So we were able to cut them all winter long. They just keep growing back. Biggest problem you have to worry about is your pests, though. You've got that plant there for 4 or 5 months growing constantly. Aphids are usually the biggest problem that start building up. And so that's where we have to come in with our organic sprays to spray on them. And we usually wait until right after we've cut and then spray, because then you get the good penetration down in these lower parts of the plant. So this is a nice picture of our spinach crop just ready to be cut. We do red kale on the right and green kale on the left. Arugula on the left and Swiss chard on the right. And I also want to point out, we don't wait until our kales get really huge. We cut them at more of a baby stage, so that way they're a nice, fresh, tender leaf for fresh eating salads. So pretty much everything we try to sell is more at the smaller baby stage. Even our Swiss chard we cut at the nice tender stage. And this is our leaf lettuce mix. We just picked several varieties that we liked, and we do our own hand mix.
A lot of our choices in varieties for salad greens is based on how they grow. We need things that will cut easily, and we have tried lots of different varieties. For example, of spinach, we had a lot of issue where we get varieties that have too much stems, and so it was really hard to cut evenly. And then if some of the stems were really tall, the restaurants did not like that. And so we every year test at least a couple different varieties of all of our different salad greens just to see if something's a little easier to cut or more volume or whatever. So it's a constant adjustment. And sometimes you lose varieties from the seed company that no longer is going to supply that one you just love. And so you better have a backup in mind for the future.
So this is our greenhouse kind of going more into the spring with a lot of interplanting. Our first thought was to try to maximize our space and get as many crops in there as we possibly could. So you can see cucumbers growing kind of in the middle, and then in between those we had some some broccolis and cauliflower, and then you can also see, so here's the broccoli and cauliflower in here, and then we put tomatoes kind of in between those spacing, usually on a 2.5 foot spacings. And then we trellis them up with the strings. We do kind of our other main crop that we grow are tomatoes. So we do a lot of salad greens kind of throughout the whole winter, and then as we start getting more to spring, we try to convert a lot of our space to tomatoes so that we can get a nice high value tomato crop around the 1st of June before anybody has them outside. So there's 2 different types of the tomatoes. There's Indeterminate, and we trellis those on a single string straight up. And then there's Determinate, and they stay kind of lower, only get about 2 to 3 foot tall, and so we have to string them up a little differently. And they kind of produce tomatoes all at one main crop at one time, where the Indeterminates, they will keep growing and set clusters of fruit as they grow up the plant. And so you can keep growing tomatoes all year round with Indeterminate if you want to give them light and heat in the wintertime. But usually in the winters here, it is just too costly to add the heat and the light, and so therefore you just don't see tomato production year round. So after our first year of doing all this interplanting, we kind of learned that too much interplanting could be a bad thing because they compete with each other too much and end up hurting your tomato crop and hurting your salad green crop all at the same time. So we've decided that we've just kind of stick with one crop at one time and then convert to tomatoes separately. So these are just some nice pictures of tomatoes that we grow and harvested throughout the year. So some misconceptions that we saw when we first started and as we went along, it just so happened propane costs. It's good to have it locked in. When we first started, we didn't get up and going until August, September. Well, propane is locked in for us in like June, and so we had already missed it. And our first year, propane soared to like $4.50 a gallon, and we did not budget $4.50 a gallon propane in. And so we ended up spending over $10,000 extra in propane than what we had planned on. Finding loans. Everybody told us you're a beginning farmer. You should have no problem finding loans for beginning farmers out there. And I kind of told you a little bit about how the government shut down at the time and they just weren't readily available when we needed them. So always kind of make sure you got your loans and your funding lined up before you decide to start buying things. And another misconception is just everyone wants fresh local produce. Most people do, but are they willing to pay the price? Our greenhouse salad greens, they cost a lot more than you would go to, say, Walmart or Hy-Vee and pick up the bag off the shelf, just because we've had to put a lot of heat into it. We have a lot of upfront costs. It's all manual labor. So it just takes a lot more work and it costs a lot more.
We've also found that we had to cold call a lot of restaurants, and you would just hear from chefs that say, I just want to order from one place and I don't want to deal with anybody else. So, it doesn't matter how good of a quality product you have, you will just have buyers that just don't want the extra work of dealing with a small farm.
The other thing you have to worry about is just constant change. There's always something changing. For restaurants, we chose to start with those because I was already had a lot of contacts with restaurants. But the thing that you realize fast is as soon as a head chef is fired or moves on, you have to start all over again. Um, Set up those ties with that new restaurant manager or chef and get them interested in buying your product all over again. So don't just assume that you're still going to have the same sales. This past year, we had a restaurant we sold 5,000 pounds of squash to. This year, they decided they're not going to run a squash soup all winter long, and so they're not going to buy any squash. So you need to constantly have a backup plan and be flexible and be ready for changes. The other thing is overall costs. We sat down, we did a cost analysis, and budgeted, and before you know it, just like on the propane, you're $10,000 over cost. So make sure you've got money squirreled away for a rainy day. The other misconception a lot of people think is, the weather in the greenhouse. You're in a protected greenhouse. You shouldn't have any problems. It's nice and warm. The thing there is that it's only as warm as you keep it. If you don't heat it at night, it's going to be very similar to the temperature outside. And then the other thing is during the daytime when it's sunny out, everybody thinks that, oh, it's just kind of a little warmer than it is outside, but that's not true. If the greenhouse is completely closed up on a winter day that's 20 degrees outside, it can easily hit 80, 90 degrees in the greenhouse on a nice sunny day. And even in the summertime, when it's 80, 90 degrees outside, if you don't have shade cloth on there, you could be looking at 110, 120, and you've just cooked all your plants. So you need to be aware of temperature fluctuations and changes throughout the year and be ready to deal with them. And the other misconception that I always hear is, you're in a greenhouse, it should be easy to grow anything, right? Well, that is true in some aspects, that you can grow anything, but you also grow problems. You also have diseases just because it's a nice, warm, humid environment. And if you don't have a lot of airflow, diseases like botrytis and molds all become very active. It's also a nice place for rodents to be able to go in the wintertime. They like it nice and warm in there too, so you have to deal with them coming in and eating your crops off. And then, as Rose had mentioned about the condensate drips inside the greenhouse, we realized that we had to cover some of the beds to keep the drip off. Otherwise, it just splashed all the soil up onto the salad greens and made them dirty, or it kept the beds so cold that nothing would grow. So we had a question about the percentage of shade cloth. We actually started out with about 65% and realized that was too much. And I've got a picture coming up that shows you what too much is. And so we've cut back to about 45-50% shade cloth. So this is the frozen tomato transplants that we got in February. And this is one of our eye-openers, that we need to grow our own transplants. So that way our timing can stay the same, and then we still have tomatoes coming in June when we want them. So this tomatoes, you'll kind of see this discoloration here, and this is just lack of pigment and development due to too much shade cloth. And we didn't realize this until after our first year. I kind of thought, a little bit of shade makes it nice and cool, so a little more shade should make it a little cooler and nicer to work in and keep it from getting too hot. Well, it also takes away too much sunlight, and then the pigments and the juice and cells don't develop very well in tomatoes. And then on the right is a picture of a deficiency in the tomatoes. So you got to constantly be on top of your crops, scouting, checking, looking for problems. Because if you can diagnose it early and get it fixed right away, you'll be okay. If you wait too long, and the tomatoes on the left here, we lost most of that crop because we waited too long. It was too late. This is another problem. We're pretty well on a nice kind of flat area, but when you put up 5 greenhouses, all that water can't be taken into the ground anymore where it's at, so it gets all ran off to a central location. This year was just a weird year. We had 5 4.5-inch rains in a 6-hour time period throughout the year, and this is what happens in a matter of 10-15 minutes. Luckily, we have kind of a little bit of a sandier soil, and so by the next morning, this would all be gone, and we just happen to get very lucky that our soil is what it is. Otherwise, we'd look at the farmer's field, just down the road, and they still had water standing, a week later. And if this happened here, all of our crops would be dead. A few hours doesn't hurt them, but you start getting into 10, 12 hours, the roots just suffocate. So one of the other misconceptions is it's always nice in the greenhouse, right? That's not always true. We have to cut the salad greens first thing in the morning because as the sun starts warming up the house, and by like 10, 11 o'clock, if it's on a sunny day, it's too hot already to cut salad greens. They start getting limp, and you want a nice, turgid plant ready to cut. And so usually when we start at 7:30 in the morning, it's only 40 degrees in this greenhouse, and most of that lettuce that you're cutting or spinach is wet. So you got 40-degree temperatures with cold, wet lettuce. So it's not always warm and sunny. Interplanting. I mentioned a little bit about we were trying to maximize our space, but we actually ended up over-competing against each other. And so we've decided just to do one crop at a time. Heirloom tomatoes in a greenhouse. Everybody wants heirloom tomatoes that you talk to until you go to sell them to them. And then they don't want to pay the price, and they don't always look the best.
We've found that the heirlooms produce a lot less volume, so you are taking up just as much space in your beds for a lot less amount of tomatoes. They crack a lot, and so you have an issue with, they're not great. Are they going to last? You may have to throw away a lot more of them.
They're just not developed for greenhouse production.
Yeah, I think they're best. We've found it's probably just best to leave them outside.
So, of course, you always want to have lots of fun. And this is me with a giant rhubarb leaf, one of the biggest I've ever seen.
And I'm standing when we're putting up all those stakes for tomatoes. It's need to make it a fun time. It's a lot of work to put all those in every year.
So this picture here, my mother-in-law had texted me from Texas and said, "Oh, look at this sunny weather. It's 86 down here." And so I took a picture of my thermometer that day, and it was below zero outside in January, and it was a nice sunny 86 degrees in the greenhouses, and I had my kids out there running around in the greenhouse, and it was a beautiful day. And these are 2 of my 4 taste testers.
And they really love salad turnips. We'll find salad turnip tops outside, and I'll know the kids have been out to visit.
And that's the end. So if anybody has any questions.
All right. Yep, exactly. Thanks a lot, Lee and Rose. I was just going to say that there have been a few questions asked, but everybody who's here listening, feel free to type in whatever's on your mind, whatever questions you have for these two, into that chat box, and they can hopefully address whatever questions you have. But Lee and Rose, there was a couple that I think maybe squeezed by that I wanted to revisit here. So while we're waiting for people to come up with some more questions, it looked like there was, you may have covered this a little bit, but Chad had a question about, he said, how do you figure what is worth the heating cost? And so you touched on your propane costs, and yeah, and I was kind of curious about, I'm sure that your operation costs increase in the winter, and you're kind of relying on salad greens then, and do you take in, do you kind of do a cost benefit analysis to see what, um, where your break-even point is, or what's worth what?
It is kind of difficult to be able to pinpoint that specifically, just because we start them in August, so you're really not putting any heat into them, and we actually get several cuts before we have to start putting heat into them, and then we go all winter long with them. So we try to keep our price the same. It is a higher price than some other people, but we do keep it the same, basically fall through spring, just because we found that restaurants, when you start fluctuating up and down, it's harder for them to keep up with it. So we don't really have a great cost analysis of, we're able to track how much we spend and how much we bring in, and so far it seems to be working out in our favor, except for that first year where we spent $10,000 in extra propane. So this year we've got it locked in for a really low price, and so you have to kind of just, it goes by year to year. Some years it's going to be greater, other years it's going to be less.
I think also the factor is this, we are new, this is our third year. And then that whole first year is almost like that outlier. You can't really put that into your number crunching because it was so skewed to such a high amount for that propane. And so I think it's going to take another couple years to get some numbers under our belt to see if the winter production is, at least breaking even, or if it is making us any profit.
We've actually decided to try to cut back on the amount of tomatoes and go more salad greens in the spring, because we found that there's just a lot more demand even in the spring for the salad greens. Rather than converting a lot of our beds over to tomatoes, we just leave them as salad greens.
Yeah, our restaurants actually would love us if we could do it 12 months out of the year, but just realistically, the houses just get too hot in the summertime anyway, even if we could. And so we need to switch over to the summer crops.
So the beds in the greenhouses are permanent raised beds. And then I think we did try one hybrid tomato from Johnny's that was like an heirloom variety. And it actually turned out really good and produced a lot at the beginning, but then it really dropped off and ended pretty early. One of our goals for profitability for two people, I also have to keep in mind my wife works as a teacher, so she brings in a separate income. And then Rose's husband also kind of works separately, so you do need other income to help support you, especially in the beginning, because you're trying to pay off all of these loans and beginning costs. You just don't have a lot of income at the beginning. So that's something you need to look at when you're first starting, is you got to have some money saved ahead to get you through the first year or two until you start becoming more profitable. You get your loans paid off, and then eventually your income should start going up.
Great. There was another question here that I wanted to ask. that Carl had asked earlier when you were talking about the site planning for your greenhouses. And he asked, how did you determine the spacing of the greenhouses to avoid shading? And could you talk a little bit about the process that you went through to determine exactly where you were going to put your greenhouses, even the orientation, like are they east, west, north, south facing, or and the spacing a little bit?
They're east-west, and the reason why I did that is because when I worked out at the berry patch, I had some going east-west and north-south, and I just felt like in the winter time, when you want the house to get warm as fast as you can, so you don't have to heat it as much, I felt that it warmed up faster facing east-west. So that's why I oriented it that direction. The spacing, I had just looked in some books, and then also we had some greenhouses out there that we had spaced, roughly 15 to 20 feet apart. And in the dead of winter, I'm out there looking at the sun angle and seeing where the shadow is cast, and that's kind of how I decided how far apart to put them. We had a question about managing the fertility in the permanent raised beds. Through the drip irrigation and by the hydrant, we have an injector. So we mix up a 20 solution of fertilizer that we inject in. And for tomatoes, we're fertilizing a lot, usually like every time. And when you start getting into the summer, we're running water like every other day. Once you get to the salad greens and more towards the winter, we still use a 20 fertilizer, but we're only having to water maybe once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. And then we do soil samples each year to see where we're at on the fertility.
Great. If anybody else has any more questions, please feel free to get them in that chat box there. One thing I thought about while I was listening to this was back at the beginning you had mentioned briefly about all the jams and jellies that you do with your berries. Do you do that in your in that building that has your germination room, or where do you do all that processing at?
We do those out of our own homes. And so we cannot sell that product to restaurants because it is not in a state certified kitchen. So those are limited to personal sales or the farmer's market, and Farm to Folk does allow jam and jellies too.
And the reason why we kind of do the jams and jellies is like this past year on strawberries, we had a lot of rain when we had a full production of strawberries. And so they start cracking and getting bad spots. So it's a good way to use up a lot of that seconds of produce, even though you cut out the bad spots and freeze them. It gives you an opportunity to still be able to sell that product as a processed jam or jelly instead of just throwing it away. Somebody asked, who did we source our greenhouses from? I actually purchased them from Knowles. They're an outfit that's up in northeast Iowa.
Charles City.
It's Knowles Garden and Greenhouse Supplies, I believe. And I found that they had by far the cheapest greenhouses, but yet very heavy-duty steel structures. Triple 20 fertilizer, just any basic 20-20-20 fertilizer is fine. Nolts, I believe, is Noltzs. Liz had asked a question about pre-mixed salad greens. We did try pre-mixes, and we just preferred to kind of choose our own. And when we first started out, we had a green romaine in there, and it was just outgrowing all of our other colors, and so we ended up having to switch to, a different green. And so over time, we just have picked out our own colors and kind of matched up the sizes so that they grow about the same speed for harvesting purposes.
The restaurants always want more and more red mix into the lettuces, and if you've looked through some catalogs, you'll realize the red is always the most expensive seed. So it's always a, cost too of how you want your mix to be, and if it's worth what you buy and put into your mix. And reds are less vigorous. They don't grow as vigorously as greens, and so you kind of got to decide what you want to do.
And when you pick salad green varieties, try to pick ones that are heavily resistant to powdery mildews and stuff, because it is in a greenhouse where you're going to have more humidity and diseases. And we just stick with the same salad green mix throughout the whole season. On harvesting, like the spinach, we just pull the whole plant up, and we don't pull it out of the ground. We just pull all the leaves up in a bunch and cut them. And so you want to make sure you leave that growing point in the center of the plant there, because that'll be your new leaves that come up later on.
And that kind of is the point of which variety you pick, because if you bunch them all up to cut them off, if you have really long stems, that's not so desirable. So we try different varieties where when you pull that leaf, all the leaves up into one point, that you're getting the shortest stems possible. So we do not vary our salad green mix. We mix up a great big pouch of it, and it's the same mix we use for the whole season, unless we're trying some new kind in there with it. But in general, it's all the same.
Looks like Carl might be typing out one more question here. Yep. One more question from Carl here, quick.
We haven't done any of those just because we try to focus on the biggest sellers, the most things that the restaurants want the most. Just because once you plant a whole row of something, it's about 90 foot long, and so you're trying to cut 15 to 25 pounds of greens off of that one row, and then there's 5 rows to a bed. And we've found out if you start mixing a lot of different things, in a bed, one will outshade the other or outcompete, and so you try to keep, varieties and growth habits similar. And usually when somebody just wants you to grow like a small variety of something, it usually doesn't always work out. But if you've got markets for some of those other things, then yeah, try them. The varieties of cucumbers we've found best to work are Thais, and you definitely need a greenhouse variety cucumber.
It's been bred specifically for greenhouses. We try to grow, I guess they're called the English types, the very long, seedless, burpless type cucumbers seem to work good.
And you can always mix more things into the lettuce mix if you want. We try to grow like the lettuce mix, just lettuce varieties, and then green kale, red kale, chard all separate. And then if we have a restaurant that wants a mix, then we just hand mix it once we get it into the building. So you could always add, some mustards, or even I've seen people add flower blooms, in the lettuce mix. It just makes it a lot more appealing.
Pollination. All of our zucchini and summer squash that we plant out in March has to be hand pollinated. And we go around and pick off the male blooms, and we go around and pollinate all the female blooms at that time of year.
So that's a daily process.
Every day.
You got to do it in the morning because they're only open for a few hours in the morning before it gets too warm. And we did do some bumblebees in the greenhouse. You can buy little pollinator hives for a crop of our tomatoes. It does cost quite a bit. They only last about 6 weeks. And so you just have to weigh the benefits. You can go through and, shake them with vibrators, but you have to, again, do it on a daily basis. Cucumbers are self-pollinating, so that kind of helps there. How many hours do we work a week? Usually in the summer, it can vary. I mean, most of the time, it's for ourselves, so we want to make the money because we want money at the end of the day. So we put in as many hours as necessary. There's been days that we usually start at 6:30 in the morning, and we'll still be there at 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night. It's just whatever it takes to get the job done. So that's something that you need to be ready for is, when things need to be done, they need to be done. So, you're the boss. You've got to be willing to get out there and put the extra time and effort in and get the work done. You want to answer about how much hours you spend on bookwork?
Oh, bookwork. Weekly bookwork, maybe 2 to 3 hours, and then monthly, once the bank statement comes out, that's another couple hours, and then tax season, who knows how much for tax season.
Each week, Rose tries to do a weekly breakdown of everything we've sold that week, so we know exactly how many pounds of lettuce we sold, how many pounds of spinach, pea shoots, radish shoots. It's all broken out so that we know where the money's coming in from and kind of what's the better seller and kind of what time of the year. And that just helps us to keep records for future use. Next year we know, hey, the restaurants really liked radish shoots, in the fall. So next year we can go and talk to them and say, hey, do you want more radish shoots, right now?
Yeah, and we're just kind of mentally trying to keep track of, wow, we sold out of arugula again this week. We could have sold more if we would have had it, and then maybe we're scrambling to get rid of too much lettuce. And so then it's something we just try to keep track of, that okay, maybe next year we're going to change our, how many rows we plant of one thing versus another, but again, you also never know what the restaurants are going to do also, so it's always kind of a guessing game, but you do the best you can.
We try to always have a good assortment, and as you can see, we grow a lot of different things. So if we do have a crop failure in a particular item, it's not going to shut you down completely. You've got other things to make up. Hopefully, this year was a very poor year at squash, and luckily we had a nice raspberry, strawberry, greens, tomatoes a year. So it kind of evens out, makes up for some of the areas where you were lacking. All of our greens, we've got food grade plastic bags. So the restaurants order, and we usually bag it up like 3 5-pound bags of greens, or in the microgreens we sell by the ounce, and so we just sell them in Ziploc bags by the ounce. They'll order anywhere from 1 to 10 or 15 ounces.
Well, thank you very much.
So we did have one last question about preparation and precautions for wind and wet snow. Last winter we had a wet snow coming in, and they were predicting like 6 to 9 inches. And so I actually went out there in the middle of the night to spend the night and just watched to make sure that it was falling off the greenhouses good, and I'd push it up from the inside to shed the snow off. Winds, just make sure everything's buttoned down, there isn't any holes in your plastic, everything's taken care of. That kind of help you on the wind.
You can also turn up the temperatures in the greenhouse
to help melt the snow.
Help melt snow if you're desperate. Wind, you just hope the wind doesn't get too bad.
And as we found out, there is no insurance for the structure covering for snow, wind, hail damage. So if the wind comes out and rips all of our plastic off tomorrow,
we have to pay for it.
It's not insured, and more than likely we'll lose all the crops inside. So that's a risk that you take.
Wow, well, thank you everybody for coming, and thanks for all of your really great questions. What a great, attentive, inquisitive group tonight. And Lee and Rose, thank you so much for a great presentation. If you want some more information from Lee and Rose, you can always check out their website. That's leesgreens.com. And they're PFI members, so you might find them around PFI events. There's the website I just put in the chat box. Great presentation. Thanks everybody for joining us. Next week, come back. Next week we've got mindset and method of cover crops in vegetable production. So that should be another great presentation. Thanks you all.